Have you ever been so utterly alone that you begin to question whether the world beyond your immediate surroundings still exists? I've been there. In fact, I'm still not entirely certain I ever truly left. I suppose I should start from the beginning. I'm a wildlife photographer by trade, though that hardly matters now. What matters is what happened to me 3 months ago in the Chugach National Forest in Alaska. I still haven't told anyone the full story. Perhaps committing it to words will help me make sense of it all, though I doubt it. It was early October, and I decided to take advantage of the last decent weather before winter set in properly. The forecast predicted light rain, nothing I couldn't handle with my gear. I've always preferred solitude when I work, so I planned a 4-day solo camping trip, hoping to capture some of the local wildlife and autumn scenery. I'd been to Chugach twice before on guided tours, but this was my first time venturing out alone. The rain started almost immediately after I arrived at the trailhead. Not the gentle patter I'd expected, but a steady, persistent downpour that seemed to muffle all other sounds in the forest. I considered turning back, my instincts practically screaming at me to return to civilization, but I'd driven nearly 3 hours to get there, and stubbornness has always been my worst trait. It's just a bit of rain, I told myself as I adjusted my rucksack and set off down the trail. It'll clear up. It didn't. By the time I'd hiked 2 hours into the forest, the rain had soaked through my supposedly waterproof jacket. My boots squished with each step, and the path had turned into a slippery mess of mud and wet leaves. Still, I pressed on, determined to reach the small lake where I planned to set up camp. Have you ever noticed how rain changes a forest? The way it transforms familiar shapes into something alien? The trees around me, tall pines and spruce, seemed to bend inward, their needles dripping with moisture, creating corridors of shadow that stretched into darkness. The usual forest sounds were gone, replaced by the constant drumming of raindrops hitting leaves. I reached the lake just as dusk was setting in, under different circumstances. It would have been beautiful, a perfect mirror reflecting the mountains and sky. But that evening, beneath the heavy clouds and relentless rain, the water looked black and impenetrable, like a void cut into the earth. Setting up camp was a miserable affair. My tent, though reliable in the past, struggled against a combination of rain and wind that had picked up as evening approached. By the time I'd secured the last peg, my fingers were numb with cold, and I was shivering uncontrollably. Inside the tent, I changed into dry clothes and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, listening to the rain patter against the fabric. I checked my mobile no service as expected. I was truly alone out here, miles from the nearest human. The thought had never bothered me before, but as darkness fell completely and the temperature dropped further, I felt a strange uneasiness settle over me. Just tired, I muttered to myself, fumbling with my camping stove to heat some soup. You'll feel better after you've eaten. That was when I heard it for the first time, a sound that didn't belong among the rain and wind. A voice. It was distant, barely audible over the weather, but unmistakably human. Someone calling out. I froze, soup forgotten, straining to hear. Hello? The voice called again, clearer this time. A woman's voice, sounding lost and frightened. I hesitated. It was nearly 9 o'clock at night, in pouring rain, miles from any designated campsite. What was someone else doing out here? Hello? The voice called again, seeming closer now. Is someone there? I need help. Despite my misgivings, I couldn't ignore a call for help. I grabbed my torch and raincoat and unzipped the tent. The rain immediately assaulted me, driven sideways by the wind that had strengthened considerably since I'd settled in. Hello. I shouted, sweeping my torch across the tree line, surrounding the small clearing where I'd pitched my tent. "I'm over here." No response came, but I was certain I'd heard someone. I took a few steps toward the forest, my boots sinking into the sodden ground. "Hello," I called again. "Where are you?" "Here," came the reply, from somewhere within the trees to my left. "Please, I'm hurt." I directed my torch toward the voice and began walking. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating raindrops and tree trunks, but little else. The forest floor was treacherous, slick with mud and hidden roots eager to trip the unwary. "Keep talking so I can find you," I shouted over the rain. "I'm here," the voice replied, sounding no closer despite my progress. "Please hurry." I continued forward, pushing through low-hanging branches that slapped wetly against my face. The rain was coming down harder now, and my torch beam seemed to penetrate less and less of the darkness ahead. "Where exactly are you?" I called, frustration beginning to edge into my voice. "Here," came the reply, but something was different about it. The voice sounded wrong somehow, hollow, as if it were coming from the bottom of a well. I stopped, a shiver running down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Something was very wrong here. "Who are you?" I demanded, my torch beam darting nervously between the trees. "I need help," the voice said, ignoring my question. It sounded closer now, but I couldn't pinpoint the direction. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. My heart began pounding my chest, and my breath came in short, sharp gasps. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run, to get back to the relative safety of my tent. But I remained rooted to the spot, unable to move as the rain pounded against me. "What's your name?" I tried again, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. Silence followed my question, broken only by the constant drumming of rain. I waited, counting the seconds, then the minutes. Nothing. Had I imagined the whole thing? I turned to head back to my tent when the voice came again, this time directly behind me, so close I could feel breath on my neck. "I have so many names," it whispered. I whirled around, torch raised like a weapon, but there was no one there, just trees and darkness and rain. I ran then, stumbling and slipping through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots catching at my feet. My torch beam bounced wildly ahead of me, creating monstrous, shifting shadows that seemed to reach for me as I passed. I had no idea if I was heading the right direction. All I knew was that I needed to get away. I don't know how long I ran before I broke through the tree line and saw my tent, a small orange dome glowing faintly from the lantern I'd left inside. Relief flooded through me, and I staggered toward it, my legs weak and trembling. Once inside, I zipped the entrance shut and huddled in my sleeping bag, shivering violently. I told myself I'd imagine it all. The voice, the whisper, the breath on my neck. Just my mind playing tricks, enhanced by fatigue and the eerie atmosphere of the forest at night. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew, gray dawn light was filtering through the tent fabric. The rain had stopped during the night, leaving behind a profound silence that was almost as unsettling as the previous night's events. I lay still for a while, listening to the forest awakening around me. Birds began to call to one another. A light breeze rustled the trees. Normal sounds, safe sounds. Feeling somewhat foolish about my midnight panic, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked different in daylight, smaller, less threatening. The lake's surface was calm now, reflecting the cloudy sky above. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary. I set about making breakfast, trying to push away the memory of that voice. Perhaps it had been a dream, or perhaps someone really had been out there, and they'd found their way to safety after I fled. Either way, I was determined to salvage my trip. I'd come for photographs, and photographs I would get. The day passed uneventfully. I hiked a few miles along the lakeshore, taking pictures of the autumn foliage and an occasional glimpse of wildlife. A red squirrel here, a marmot there, no sign of any other humans, which was exactly as I'd expected when planning this trip. As evening approached, I found myself growing increasingly anxious about returning to camp. The memory of the previous night loomed large in my mind, and I found myself checking over my shoulder more often than was reasonable. By the time I reached my tent, the light was already failing, and a light drizzle had begun to fall once more. I made dinner quickly and retreated inside, zipping myself in before full darkness descended. Tonight, I decided I would not leave the tent for anything short of catching fire. I had enough water, food, and a bottle to relieve myself if necessary. There was no reason to venture out. For a while, everything was quiet. I reviewed the day's photographs on my camera, made notes in my journal, and eventually settled down to read a bit before sleep. The patter of rain against the tent was almost soothing now, a reminder that I was inside, dry and safe. I must have dozed off while reading because I suddenly jerked awake, disoriented. The lantern was still on, but dimmer now as the batteries began to fade. Something had woken me. A sound. I held my breath, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but the rain, which had strengthened again into a proper downpour. Then I heard footsteps, the unmistakable sound of someone walking slowly around my tent. My heart leapt into my throat. I reached for my torch, clutching it like a talisman as the footsteps continued their measured circuit. Whoever or whatever was out there was in no hurry, each step deliberate and unhurried. "Hello," I called out, my voice embarrassingly weak. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. For several long seconds, there was only silence and the sound of rain. Then, slowly, a hand pressed against the outside of my tent, directly beside my head. I could see the impression of fingers through the fabric, pushing gently but insistently. "Let me in," said the voice from the previous night, still with that strange, hollow quality. "I'm cold and wet. Let me in." I scrambled to the opposite side of the tent, as far from that hand as possible. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. "A traveler like you," the voice replied. The hand remained pressed against the tent. "Let me in. It's raining. I'm so cold." "There's a ranger station 5 miles north of here," I said. "They'll lie coming easily. They'll have proper shelter." "I don't want the ranger station," the voice said, a note of petulance entering its tone. "I want coming there. With you. Let me in." "No," I said firmly, though my whole body was trembling. "Please leave me alone." The hand withdrew, and for a moment I thought whoever was had listened to me. Then something sharp traced a line down the side of the tent. Not hard enough to cut through, but enough to make the fabric dimple inward. "I could come in anyway," the voice said, now moving around to the other side of the tent, following the path of whatever sharp implement it was dragging along the exterior. "This thin little shell you built, it wouldn't take much to tear it open." I was properly terrified now, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I fumbled for my mobile, though I knew there was no service. Still, it was something to do, something to focus on besides the slow, deliberate movement outside my tent. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The movement stopped again, this time at the tent entrance. I watched in horror as the zipper began to move downward, millimeter by millimeter, though no hand was visible pulling it. "I want company," the voice said, now coming from directly outside the entrance. "It gets so lonely out here in the rain." The zipper continued its inexorable downward journey. I lunged forward and grabbed it, trying to force it back up, but it continued to descend as if pulled by a much stronger force than mine. "Stop," I shouted, real panic setting in now. "Please, just leave me alone." To my surprise, the zipper stopped moving. There was a pause, and then the voice spoke again, softer now, almost gentle. "Do you know what happens to people who die alone in these woods?" It asked conversationally. "No one finds them for such a long time. Sometimes never. They just disappear, become part of the forest. Would you like that? To become part of something greater than yourself?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat had closed up with fear. "I'll come back tomorrow night," the voice continued. "Maybe you'll be more hospitable then." And with that, the presence withdrew. I heard footsteps moving away from the tent, growing fainter until they were swallowed by the sound of rain. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat huddled in my sleeping bag, torch in one hand, my small camping knife in the other, waiting for dawn. By the time morning light finally seeped through the tent walls, I was exhausted, my eyes gritty and burning, my body aching from being held in the same tense position for hours. It took me less than 20 minutes to break camp. I left behind anything non-essential, stuffing only what I absolutely needed into my rucksack. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast and threatening as I set off back toward the trailhead, at a pace just short of running. Every sound made me jump. A bird taking flight, a branch creaking in the wind, the occasional plop of collected rainwater falling from leaves. The forest, which had seemed merely indifferent yesterday, now felt actively hostile. Eyes watched me from the shadows between trees. Whispers followed me down the path. Have you ever felt like nature itself had turned against you? Like the very ground beneath your feet was eager to swallow you whole? That's how I felt as I fled through Chugach that morning. I was perhaps halfway back to the trailhead when the rain began again, heavier than before. Within minutes, the path became a muddy stream, making progress difficult and treacherous. I slipped several times, once falling hard enough to wind myself, but fear drove me back to my feet and onward. It was during one of these falls that I lost the path. I'd been moving too quickly, paying more attention to what might be behind me than to where I was going. One moment the trail was beneath my feet. The next, I was picking myself up from a tumble down a small embankment, surrounded by unfamiliar terrain. I tried to climb back up to where I thought the path should be, but the mud made it impossible. My boots couldn't find purchase on the slick ground, and I slid back down with each attempt, acquiring new scrapes and bruises from my trouble. "Keep calm," I told myself aloud, needing to hear a human voice, even if it was only my own. "Just follow the slope downhill. You'll hit another trail or a stream that leads to the lake." But hours passed, and I found neither trail nor lake. The rain continued unabated, and the forest grew darker as the already overcast day yielded to an early dusk. I was lost, thoroughly lost, and night was falling. The realization should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a strange calm descend. I was too tired, too cold, and too wet to sustain the level of fear I'd been carrying all day. It had burned itself out, leaving behind a dull resignation. I found a relatively dry spot beneath a large spruce tree and sat down, leaning against the trunk. My rucksack provided some cushioning against the rough bark. I should keep moving. I knew that. Find shelter. Build a fire if possible. Do all the things they teach you about wilderness survival. But my body refused to cooperate. I just needed to rest. Just for a moment. I must have fallen asleep because I jerked awake to complete darkness. The rain had stopped again, but water still dripped from the branches above, plopping onto my already sodden clothing. I was shivering violently, my body's way of telling me I needed warmth, and soon, with numb fingers, I fumbled for my torch. It took 3 attempts to switch it on, and when I did, the beam seemed feeble and sickly in the vast darkness of the forest. I directed it around me, trying to get my bearings. That was when I saw the footprints. Fresh ones, pressed into the mud, not 3 feet from where I sat. They circled my tree, coming to a stop directly in front of me, as if someone had stood there, watching me sleep. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the protests of my stiff muscles. My torch beam darted frantically from tree to tree, seeking the owner of those footprints, but the forest appeared empty. "I know you're there," I called, surprising myself at the steadiness of my voice. "What do you want from me?" Silence answered me, not the natural silence of forest at night, which is never truly silent at all, but complete absence of sound. No dripping water, no rustling leaves, no scurrying nocturnal creatures, nothing. And then, from everywhere and nowhere at once, "I want you to stay." The voice was different now, not just hollow, but layered, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison, slightly out of sync with each other. "I need to get back," I said, slowly turning in place, torch extended. "People are expecting me. They'll come looking if I don't return." A laugh rippled through the trees, causing the hairs on the back of my neck to stand on end. "No one is coming," the voices said with certainty. "No one knows exactly where you are. No one will find you." It was right. I realized a sinking feeling. I hadn't filed a detailed trip plan with anyone. My friends knew I was in Chugach, but the National Forest covered over 6 million acres. They wouldn't know where to begin looking. "What are you?" I asked, my voice barely audible even to myself. "I am the forest," the voice replied simply. "I am the rain in the trees and the darkness between the stars. I am very old and very lonely." A figure stepped into the edge of my torch beam then, a woman, or something shaped like a woman. She was tall and painfully thin, dressed in what appeared to be rags that hung from a frame like moss from a tree. Her hair was long and tangled, the color of wet bark, and her skin had a greenish-gray pallor that made her look like a corpse that had been underwater for too long. But it was her eyes that froze a scream in my throat. They were not eyes at all, but empty sockets filled with what looked like small, writhing creatures. Centipedes or millipedes, perhaps, though I couldn't be sure in the dim light of my failing torch. And frankly, I didn't want to look closely enough to find out. "Do you like this shape?" she asked, her mouth stretching into something approximate to a smile, revealing teeth that were too numerous and too sharp to be human. "I made it just for you, from memories I found in the forest." I backed away slowly, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. "What memories?" I managed to ask. "The ones left behind," she said, following my retreat with slow, deliberate steps. "By those who came before, those who stayed." "I can't stay," I said, still backing away. "I'm sorry, but I need to go home." "Home," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Yes, I remember home. Warm, safe, but so temporary. The forest is forever. Stay with me, and you could be forever too. I kept backing away, and she kept following, maintaining the same distance between us. I had no idea where I was going, backward through an unfamiliar forest in the dark. But anywhere seemed better than staying near this creature. Others have stayed, she continued conversationally. So many others. Some willingly. Most not so much. As she spoke, I became aware of movement in the forest around us. Shapes detaching themselves from the darkness between trees, moving with a shambling gait that suggested limbs that didn't quite work properly. They were too far away to see clearly in the dim light of my torch, and for that, I was profoundly grateful. They're lonely too, the woman thing said, noticing my attention shift the shapes. They've been waiting for someone new to join them, someone fresh. The shapes moved closer, forming a loose circle around us. There were dozens of them, perhaps more, emerging from between the trees like the forest itself was giving birth to them. Some moved on all fours, others upright but stooped and twisted. All were silent. You could be my voice, the woman thing said, suddenly much closer than she had been a moment before, though I hadn't seen her move. When travelers come, you could call to them for me, bring them to us. Like you called to me that first night, I said, understanding dawning. You were never lost or hurt. It was a trap. She smiled again, wider this time, her jaw unhinging slightly to accommodate the expression. Clever, she said, sounding pleased. Yes, a trap. The lost and hurt routine works well. Humans are so predictably compassionate. The way she said compassionate made it sound like a disease, something pitiable and weak. Perhaps to her it was, I need to go home. I repeated, more firmly this time, though my voice shook. No, she said simply. You need to stay. She lunged then, faster than anything should be able to move, her arms extending impossibly long, fingers elongating into claw-like appendages that reached for my throat. I don't remember deciding to run. One moment I was frozen in terror. The next, I was crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, roots catching at my feet, but somehow remaining upright through sheer panic-fueled determination. Behind me, a howl went up, not from one throat, but from many, a chorus of hunger and rage that echoed through the forest. The sound of pursuit followed immediately. Cracking branches, rustling leaves, and the unmistakable pounding of feet upon earth. I ran blindly, with no direction in mind except away. My torch beam bounced wildly ahead of me, illuminating obstacles a second before I reached them, just enough time to dodge or leap over them. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but fear drove me onward. How long I ran, I couldn't say. Time lost all meaning in that desperate flight. At some point, the pursuing sound began to fade, whether because I was outpacing my hunters or because they had given up, I neither knew nor cared. I simply kept running until my body refused to continue. I collapsed against a tree, gulping air into my starved lungs, my entire body trembling with exhaustion and residual terror. For several minutes, I just stood there, listening intently for any sign of pursuit. There was nothing but the normal sounds of forest at night, which now seemed blessedly ordinary compared to what I just fled. When I finally caught my breath enough to think clearly, I realized I was more lost than ever. I had no idea which direction I'd run, no idea how to find my way back to a trail or to the lake. All I knew was that I couldn't stay where I was. I was about to push off in a tree and continue my journey, walking this time, as my legs wouldn't support another run, when a faint orange glow caught my eye through the trees ahead. Fire, or electric light. Either way, it meant people. Hope surged through me. giving me a second wind. I moved toward the light, more carefully now, wary of making too much noise. If it was a campsite, I didn't want to startle the occupants by crashing out of the forest like a madman. As I drew closer, I saw that it was indeed a campsite, a small clearing with a tent very similar to my own. A lantern hung from a branch nearby, casting that welcoming orange glow that had drawn me in. "Hello?" I called softly, not wanting to scare whoever was inside the tent. "Is anyone there? I need help. I'm lost." No response came from the tent. Perhaps its occupant was asleep. I moved closer, raising my voice slightly. "Hello? Please, I need help." Still nothing. I approached the tent cautiously, noting that it appeared to be in perfect condition. No sign of the vicious weather that had plagued the forest for the past 2 days. Odd. But perhaps this area had been sheltered from the worst of it. I reached for the tent's zipper, hesitating only briefly before pulling it down. "Hello?" I called again as I opened the entrance. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but The words died in my throat as I peered inside the tent. It was empty, completely empty. No sleeping bag, no personal items, nothing. Just the bare interior of a tent that appeared to have never been used. I backed away slowly, a sick feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. Something was very wrong here. I turned to leave the clearing, and found myself face to face with the woman thing from the forest. "Welcome home," she said, her mouth stretching into that too wide smile. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I tried to scream, but no sound emerged from my throat. I could only stand there, paralyzed, as she reached for me with those impossibly long fingers. "Don't worry," she said soothingly. "It only hurts for a little while. Then you become part of the forest, part of me." Her fingers touched my face, cold and damp like the underside of a rotting log. Where they made contact, I felt a spreading numbness, as if my very life force was being drained away. "Please," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. "Sure," she replied, her face now inches from mine. I could smell her breath, like wet earth and decaying leaves. "It's already done." And then darkness took me. I woke up in hospital. According to the doctors, a park ranger found me unconscious at a trailhead parking area, suffering from severe hypothermia and dehydration. My clothes were torn and muddy, and I had numerous cuts and bruises consistent with having wandered lost in rough terrain. I had been missing for 5 days, though I only remembered 3. They said I was lucky to be alive, that people who get lost in Chugach during bad weather often aren't found at all. I didn't tell them about the woman thing or her shambling companions. I didn't tell them about the voice that called me from the rain-soaked darkness, or the empty tent that appeared just when I needed shelter most. They would have added hallucinations due to exposure to my chart and recommended psychiatric evaluation. Perhaps they would have been right. Perhaps it was all a hallucination, my oxygen-starved brain creating monsters from shadows as I wandered lost and afraid through the wilderness. But I don't think so, because sometimes when it rains, especially at night, I hear her voice again, not in the forest, but in my flat in the city, hundreds of miles from Chugach. She whispers to me from the sound of raindrops hitting my window, reminds me of our time together, tells me she's waiting for me to return. And sometimes in the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of her, standing in my shower as water streams down, or reflected in puddles on the pavement as I walk to work. Always watching, always waiting. The doctors say I can leave hospital tomorrow, that I've made a full physical recovery. But I know better. I left something behind in those woods. Something vital that I can never get back. And I took something with me when I left. Something that whispers to me in the rain and watches me with eyes that are not eyes at all. So here's my advice to you, friend. If you ever find yourself in Chugach National Forest and you hear a voice calling for help in the rain, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because the forest is hungry and it's patient, and it has all the time in the world to wait for you to become part of it. As for me, well, I think I might go camping again soon. She's been getting louder lately, more insistent, and I'm so very, very tired of running. Are you hearing the rain right now? As you listen to my story, listen closely. Is it really just raindrops you hear? Or is something else whispering to you from between the sounds? Remember, the forest is patient, and it knows your name. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened to me in Chugach National Forest. Not my therapist, not my wife, not even the search and rescue team that found me huddled in that cave, severely dehydrated and babbling nonsense about the thing that walks between the trees. They all assumed it was the hypothermia talking. Perhaps it would have been easier if that were true. It's been 3 years now. The nightmares have subsided from nightly to weekly occurrences. I can almost convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Almost, but not quite. The rain pattering against my window tonight brings it all back with such clarity that I might as well be there again, feeling that bone-deep cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. You're probably wondering why I'm sharing this now. I suppose I need someone to know what's out there, in case. Well, in case I'm not around much longer. I've started seeing things again, you see, glimpses of movement just outside my peripheral vision. The smell of wet fur and rotting meat when I'm alone in the house. I think it found me. I think it followed me home. But I should start at the beginning. I've been planning the backpacking trip for months. A 2-week solo excursion through some of the more remote parts of Chugach. I'm an experienced hiker and wilderness guide with over 15 years of backcountry experience. I've weathered blizzards in the Rockies and faced down a grizzly in Yellowstone. I wasn't some naive tourist wandering off trail without proper equipment. I want you to understand that because it matters. What happened to me wasn't the result of poor planning or inexperience. The first 4 days of my trip were uneventful. The weather was surprisingly cooperative for Alaska in early autumn. Cool but not cold, with only occasional light rain. The kind of weather that makes you grateful to be alive and outdoors. I covered about 12 miles each day, photographing wildlife in the stunning autumn colors that painted the landscape in fiery oranges and deep reds. On the 5th day, I reached what my map identified as Raven Lake, a small, isolated body of water nestled between 2 ridges, about 20 miles from the nearest marked trail. I'd read about it in an obscure hiking forum, described as pristine and untouched, like stepping back in time. That appealed to me, the chance to experience true wilderness, away from the relatively well-traveled paths. I arrived at Raven Lake in the late afternoon. The lake itself was smaller than I'd expected, perhaps a quarter-mile across, surrounded by dense spruce forest that grew almost to the water's edge. A thin strip of rocky beach provided just enough space to make camp. The water was incredibly still, reflecting the darkening sky like a perfect mirror. It should have been beautiful, but something about it made me uneasy. Perhaps it was too still, too quiet. There were no birds calling, no insects buzzing, just an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound I made. Just tired. I told myself as I set up my tent, you've been pushing hard for days. Of course it feels strange to stop. I cooked a simple dinner on my camp stove and ate watching the sun sink behind the ridge. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped significantly. I pulled on an extra layer and sat by my small campfire, enjoying the warmth and light while sipping a cup of tea. That's when I noticed the markings on the trees. My headlamp caught them as I was scanning the tree line. Crude symbols carved into the bark of several pines at the edge of the forest. They weren't fresh. The edges of the carvings were weathered and, in some cases, partially grown over. I approached the nearest tree to examine them more closely. The symbol resembled a stick figure with antlers or branches extending from its head, surrounded by smaller markings I couldn't decipher. Probably just previous campers. I muttered, though I didn't entirely believe it. The carvings had an intentional, ritualistic quality that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I returned to my fire, but the discovery had unsettled me. I found myself constantly glancing toward the forest, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. When I finally turned in for the night, I made sure my bear spray and knife were within easy reach. Not that either would be much use against a determined grizzly, but their presence was comforting. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by strange dreams of running through endless trees, pursued by something I couldn't see but could feel getting closer with each labored breath. I woke shortly before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cold. As I lay in my sleeping bag, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving slowly around my tent. At first, I thought it might be a bear, but the rhythm was all wrong. These were bipedal footsteps, something walking on two legs. A person then? But what would another hiker be doing out here, circling my tent in the pre-dawn darkness? I held my breath, hoping whoever or whatever it was would move on. The footsteps completed a full circuit of my tent, then stopped directly in front of the entrance. I could see a shadow there, cast by the faint moonlight, tall and humanoid, but oddly proportioned, with elongated limbs and what appeared to be antlers or branches protruding from its head. "Hello," I called out, my voice embarrassingly shaky. "Is someone there?" No response came. The shadow remained motionless. I fumbled for my headlamp and switched it on, directing the beam toward the tent entrance. Nothing was there. No shadow, no figure. Nothing but the silent forest beyond. I unzipped the tent, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. The clearing was empty, the lake still and black in the pre-dawn light. I swept my headlamp across the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, there were footprints in the soft ground around my tent. Large, barefoot human prints that circled my tent exactly as I'd heard, ending abruptly a few feet from the entrance. I followed them with my light, trying to see where they led, but they simply stopped, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in my tent, knife in hand, listening to forest around me slowly come alive with the dawn. By the time the sun had fully risen, I convinced myself the footprints were probably from a previous camper, and my exhausted mind had manufactured the sounds to match my anxiety. It wasn't a particularly convincing explanation, but it was the only one that didn't make my skin crawl. I spent that day hiking the circumference of the lake, partly to explore and partly to look for signs of other campers. I found none. No fire rings, no trash, no indications that anyone had been here recently. What I did find, however, were more of those strange symbols carved into trees at seemingly random intervals around the lake. Always the same antlered figure, sometimes accompanied by smaller markings. Some carvings looked decades old, others more recent. As the day progressed, the weather began to change. Clouds rolled in from the north, dark and heavy with rain. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a damp chill settled over the landscape. I cut my exploration short and returned to camp to secure my gear before the storm hit. The rain began just as I finished reinforcing my tent stakes. A light drizzle at first, quickly intensifying into a steady downpour. I retreated inside, grateful for the waterproof fabric as the rain drummed against it. Outside, the daylight faded prematurely as the storm clouds thickened, plunging the world into a gloomy twilight despite it being only mid-afternoon. I checked my satellite phone, thinking I might call for an early extraction if the weather was settling in for a long spell. No signal. I wasn't particularly concerned. These devices can be temperamental in remote areas with heavy cloud cover. I'd try again when the storm passed. As evening approached and the rain showed no signs of abating, I prepared a cold dinner, protein bars and beef jerky, not one to cook in the tent or brave the deluge outside. The temperature continued to drop, and I found myself shivering despite being wrapped in my sleeping bag. It wasn't just a cold, though. There was something about this place, something fundamentally wrong that I couldn't articulate but could feel in my bones. Night fell, and with it came the footsteps again, circling, pausing, circling. This time I didn't call out. I lay perfectly still, knife clutched in my chest, barely breathing as the unknown visitor completed 3 full circuits of my tent before stopping at the entrance again. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, just as my cramped muscles were beginning to scream for movement, I heard a new sound, a soft scraping against the fabric of my tent, as if something was running its hand or claw gently down the side. "I know you're awake in there," a voice whispered, so close it might have been inside the tent with me. The voice was peculiar, raspy and dry, like dead leaves blowing across pavement, but with an underlying wetness, a gurgling quality that made me think of drowning. Fear paralyzed me. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart hammered so loudly I was certain the thing outside could hear it. "I can smell your fear," it continued, still in that terrible whisper, sweet like crushed berries. I remained silent, desperately hoping it would think I was asleep or not there at all. The scratching continued, moving around the tent once more. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. "This place is not for your kind. Not anymore." Finally, I found my voice. "What do you want?" I managed, the words barely audible. The scratching stopped. "Want?" it replied, a note of amusement in its voice. "I want many things. I want the forest as it was before your kind came with your axes and roads. I want the silence that existed before your machines. I want the darkness that reigned before your lights." It paused, and I heard a sound like sniffing, loud and animal. "But tonight, I just want to taste your fear, to feel your heart race as you contemplate what I might be, what I might do. I'm not afraid of you." I lied, my voice stronger than I expected. A sound came then, not quite a laugh, more like the cracking of ice on a frozen lake. "Yes, you are, and you should be. Your kind has forgotten what it means to fear the wild places. You come with your maps and your gadgets, thinking you understand, thinking you belong. You don't." The rain intensified, drumming against the tent like impatient fingers. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating a tall, antlered silhouette against the fabric of my tent. In that split-second glimpse, I saw that what I had taken for antlers were actually elongated, branch-like fingers extending from its head, twitching and curling like tentacles. "Tomorrow night," it whispered as the thunder rolled overhead, "I will come for you, not just to frighten, but to take, to feed, to transform. One more day of freedom, little trespasser. Use it wisely. And then it was gone. I knew it was gone the same way you know when someone leaves a room. Even without seeing them go, a change in the air, a lifting of pressure. I lay there, knife still clutched in my white-knuckled grip, until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the tent fabric. When I finally summoned courage to emerge, I found new footprints in the mud around my tent, impossibly large and oddly shaped, with too many toes, each ending in what looked like a claw mark. They led from my tent directly into the lake, disappearing beneath the dark water. I packed my gear with shaking hands. There was no question of staying another night. Whatever had visited me, whatever impossible thing had whispered those threats, I had no intention of being there when it returned. I would hike out today, making for the nearest ranger station or trail, even if it meant traveling through the night. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained overcast, the air thick with moisture and the promise of more storms to come. I shouldered my pack and consulted my GPS for the quickest route back to civilization. To my dismay, the device wouldn't power on, despite having fresh batteries. My satellite phone remained equally unresponsive. The compass, at least, still worked, and I had my paper maps. I wasn't completely without resources. I set off heading southeast, where I knew there was a marked trail about 18 miles away. If I pushed hard, I could reach it before nightfall. The forest seemed to close in around me as I hiked, the trees growing denser and the undergrowth more tangled with each mile. Several times I had to backtrack and find new routes as my path became impassable. The going was slow and frustrating, and by midday, I realized I covered less than a quarter of the distance I'd hoped to. As the hours passed, I began to suspect I was being led in circles. Landmarks I was certain I'd never seen before nevertheless felt familiar, as if I'd passed them recently. The compass readings made no sense, nor seemed to change location, the needle swinging wildly before settling in a different direction each time I checked it. By late afternoon, I was forced to accept that I was thoroughly lost. The overcast sky made it impossible to navigate by the sun, and without my GPS or reliable compass readings, I had no way to maintain a consistent direction. Worse, the temperature was dropping rapidly as another storm system moved in. I needed to find shelter before dark. I stumbled upon the cave purely by chance, a dark opening in a rocky hillside, partially concealed by fallen logs and dense undergrowth. It wasn't ideal, but it would provide better protection from the elements than my tent. I cleared the entrance and peered inside, relieved to find it dry and large enough to accommodate me comfortably. As I set up a makeshift camp inside the cave, I discovered something troubling. More of those carved symbols, these etched directly into the stone walls. They were everywhere, hundreds of them, covering every surface. The same antlered figure, but here accompanied by scenes that turned my stomach. Crude but unmistakable depictions of hunting, of capture, of transformation. Human figures changing, growing antlers or branches from their heads, their limbs elongating, becoming something else, something not human. I should have left immediately, but the first fat raindrops were already beginning to fall, and darkness was closing in fast. I told myself they were just carvings, just superstitious nonsense left by indigenous people or early settlers. They couldn't hurt me. I built a small fire near the cave entrance, more for comfort than warmth, and heated water for my freeze-dried meal. As I ate, I kept glancing at the carvings, unable to ignore their presence. They seemed to watch me, especially the larger central figure, a more elaborate version of the antlered being. This one depicted with a human in its grasp, the human's body twisted, as if in mid-transformation. Night fell, and with it came the rain, a torrential downpour that created a curtain of water across the cave entrance. The sound was almost deafening, drowning out everything else. I sat by my fire, watching the flames cast dancing shadows on the carved walls, trying to ignore the way those shadows seemed to move independently, giving life to the grim scenes depicted there. I must have dozed off because I jerked awake suddenly, disoriented and cold. The fire had burned down to embers, and something had changed. The rain had stopped. The silence was absolute. Not even the drip of water or the call of a night bird to break it. Just a thick, waiting silence that pressed against my ears like cotton wool. Something moved at the cave entrance, a tall, thin silhouette blacker than the night behind it. I scrambled backwards, reaching for my headlamp. But before I could switch it on, the figure spoke. I told you I would come for you. That same rasping, gurgling voice from the night before. Did you think these old markings would protect you? They are mine. They tell my story. It stepped into the cave, ducking its head to clear the entrance. In the dim red glow of the dying embers, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was tall, impossibly so, its head nearly brushing the 7-foot ceiling of the cave. Its body was emaciated, ribs and hip bones protruding sharply beneath tight, gray-green skin that glistened wetly in the firelight. Its arms hung almost to the ground, ending in hands with 2 long fingers tipped with black claws. But its head, God, its head was the worst part. Elongated and vaguely deer-like, but wrong. The proportions all skewed, the snout too long, the eyes too far apart and entirely black, without iris or pupil. And from its skull grew not antlers, but twisted, branch-like protrusions that moved and writhed of their own accord, like tentacles or worms. What are you? I whispered, my back pressed against the cold stone wall, nowhere left to retreat. I am hunger, it replied. I am the thing that walks between the trees. I am the Wendigo. It took another step toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if its joints bend in ways they shouldn't. Once I was like you, weak, human, lost in these woods during a winter storm. Hungry, so hungry. Another step. I could smell it now, a nauseating mixture of wet fur, rotting meat, and something else, something chemical and acrid. I ate my companions first. It continued conversationally. Then, anyone I could find. The hunger never stopped. It only grew, and I grew with it, becoming this. It gestured to its twisted body with one long-fingered hand. Now I am the forest, and the forest is hungry. It lunged then, faster than anything that size should be able to move, its clawed hands reaching for me. I reacted on pure instinct, grabbing a burning branch from the fire and thrusting it toward the creature's face. It recoiled with a shriek that sounded like a wounded elk crossed for human scream, its tentacle antlers writhing in agitation. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted past it, out of the cave and into the night. The rain had indeed stopped, but the ground was treacherous, slick with mud and hidden roots. I ran without direction, without thought, pure terror driving me forward through the darkness. Behind me, that awful shriek came again, followed by the sound of pursuit, heavy footfalls and the crack of breaking branches. It was following, and it was fast. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out beneath me. I ran until I couldn't hear its pursuit anymore, until the only sounds were my own labored breathing and the pounding of my heart. I ran until I broke through the trees and found myself on the shore of a lake, Raven Lake. I realized with sinking feeling. Somehow, I'd run in a circle, ending up back where I'd started. My tent was still there, a small dome of orange nylon glowing faintly in the moonlight that now broke through the dissipating clouds. I staggered toward it, desperate for any sense of familiarity, any illusion of safety. I just reached the tent when I heard it, the snap of a twig behind me. I whirled around to see the Wendigo standing at the edge of the forest, its black eyes fixed on me, its branched tentacles weaving hypnotically. "There is no escape," it said simply. "This is my domain. Every path leads back to me. Every trail circles to where I wait." It stepped forward onto the rocky beach. "But I offer you a choice. Join me willingly. Become like me. Hunger, but never die. Or fight and suffer before the change comes anyway." "I'll never become like you," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. It tilted its head, an eerily human gesture from such an inhuman creature. They all say that. In the beginning, it took another step forward, and another. I backed away, moving toward the lake. It followed, unhurried, confident in its inevitability. "The water won't save you," it said, noticing my retreat toward the shore. "I was born of starvation, not fire. I do not fear the wet." My foot touched the water's edge. I had nowhere left to go. The Wendigo was only feet away now, close enough that I could see the textures of its skin. Not smooth as I first thought, but covered in fine, translucent hairs like moss. "Last chance," it whispered. "Choose transformation. Choose power." In that moment, with death or worse staring me in the face, something snapped inside me. Not courage, exactly, but a kind of fatalistic clarity. If I was going to die, I wouldn't do it cowering on the shore. I lunged forward, ducking under its reaching arms, and drove my knife into its side. The blade sank in with surprising ease, as if the creature's flesh was half-rotted. A foul-smelling ichor spurred from the wound, black in the moonlight. The Wendigo howled, not in pain, but in rage. One of its massive hands caught me across the chest, sending me flying backward into the shallow water of the lake. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, and for crucial seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was on me before I could recover, its weight pinning me half in, half out of the water. Its face loomed above mine, jaws unhinging to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. The branched tentacles reached for me, wrapping around my arms and neck, burning like acid where they touched bare skin. "You will join us," it hissed, its breath hot and fetid against my face. "Your flesh will feed us. Your spirit will become one with the forest. Your suffering will be exquisite." I thrashed beneath it, fighting with everything I had left, but it was like wrestling a tree, implacable, rooted in its strength. One of the tentacles forced its way into my mouth, tasting of soil and blood and corruption. I gagged, feeling it push deeper, down my throat, burning all the way. In desperation, I reached for anything I could use as a weapon. My hand closed around a rock on the lake bed, small but with sharp edge. With the last of my strength, I slammed it into the creature's eye. The effect was instantaneous and unexpected. The Wendigo reared back, clawing at its injured eye, the tentacle withdrawing from my throat. It shrieked, a sound so loud and terrible I felt something in my ear pop, replaced by a high-pitched ringing. I didn't question my luck. I scrambled away, half crawling, half swimming toward deeper water. The Wendigo thrashed on the shore, black ichor pouring from its ruined eye, its movements becoming increasingly erratic. I swam until I couldn't any longer, then clung to a fallen tree that protruded from the water near the center of the lake. From this vantage point, I watched as the Wendigo finally stilled, then slowly, jerkily, returned to forest, disappearing among the trees. I stayed in the water until dawn, shivering uncontrollably, too terrified to return to shore. When the sun finally rose, casting warm light across the lake, I swam back, half expecting the creature to be waiting for me. But the beach was empty, save for my scattered gear and a large, dark stain where the Wendigo had bled. I abandoned everything except my emergency beacon, which I activated immediately. Then I climbed the tallest nearby ridge to get clear of the tree cover, hoping to increase my chances of the signal being detected. 3 days later, a search and rescue helicopter spotted me. By then, I was delirious from exposure and dehydration, raving about the thing in the woods. They attributed my stories to hypothermia and trauma. The official report listed me as having been lost due to equipment failure and bad weather. I tried to tell them about the Wendigo, about the carvings in the trees and cave, but when a ranger was sent to investigate, he found nothing. No cave, no carvings, not even my abandoned gear. Just an ordinary lake in an ordinary forest. They looked at me with such pity after that, speaking in hushed tones about PTSD and possible psychosis brought on by my ordeal. Eventually, I stopped trying to convince them. I returned to my life, to my job and my relationships. I told myself that perhaps they were right. Perhaps it had been a hallucination, a nightmare born of fear and isolation. But I know what I saw. I know what touched me, what tried to change me. And sometimes when it rains at night, I can feel it watching me through the darkness, waiting, patient. And there's something else, something I haven't told anyone, not even my therapist. Sometimes when I'm very hungry, I catch myself staring at people, at my colleagues, my friends, even my wife, and thinking not about who they are, but about how they might taste. In those moments, I can feel something stirring inside me, something that was planted that night by the lake, something growing, like branches reaching toward the light. I've started finding moss growing on my skin in the mornings, tiny patches of green on my arms and chest that I scrub away in the shower. My joints ache when the weather changes, bending in ways they never used to. And when I dream of running through endless forests, no longer pursued but the pursuer. So I'm telling you this as a warning. Stay away from Raven Lake. Stay away from the remote parts of Chugach where the trees grow too close together and the shadows move independently of what casts them. But most of all, if you're ever hiking and come across strange carvings of an antler figure on the trees, turn around, go back the way you came, and don't look behind you, no matter what sound you hear, because the Wendigo is patient, and the Wendigo is hungry, and once it has chosen you, marked you, tasted you, it never truly lets you go. Can you hear the rain outside? Listen closely. Those aren't just raindrops on your window. That's the tap, tap, tap of long, branch-like fingers waiting to be invited in. Still with us, Traveler of the Dark? If you've made it this far into our tales of haunted campsites and whispers in the woods, we'd love to know, where are you listening from? And what time is it in your world right now? Are you nestled in bed with the lights off, driving down an empty road, or maybe camping somewhere yourself? Drop a comment and let us know, not just so we know you survived the story, but because there's something eerie and wonderful about knowing where our little campfire reaches in the night. We'll be reading and watching, always watching. I've never been a particularly superstitious person. As a geologist working in remote locations, I've learned to trust science, evidence, and my own senses above all else. But what happened to me last summer in the Chugach National Forest has shattered those certainties, leaving me with questions I cannot answer and memories I cannot escape. The soft patter of rain against my window tonight reminds me of that night. The night everything changed. I find myself checking the locks twice, drawing the curtains tight, and still, I cannot shake the feeling that something followed me home from those woods. Something that waits and watches and whispers in the spaces between raindrops. I suppose I should tell you how it began, though I wonder if speaking it aloud will only give it more power. Still, perhaps in the telling, I might find some measure of peace. I was part of a geological survey team mapping an unexplored valley deep within the Chugach Range. There were 5 of us initially, myself, Dr. Eliza Winters, our team lead, Marcus Chun, our equipment specialist, Danny Ortiz, our field botanist, and James Holden, our guide. We were cataloging unusual rock formations reported by a previous expedition, with a secondary objective of collecting soil samples for environmental analysis. The location was remote enough that we needed to be helicoptered in, landing at a small plateau about 3 miles from our primary research site. From there, we'd hike to base camp, establish our equipment, and spend 2 weeks gathering data before extraction. Have you ever felt a place reject you? As at the very air, the soil beneath your boots, the surrounding trees, all of it collectively decided you did not belong? That's what the valley felt like from the moment we set foot in it. The locals had a name for it, Dena'ina Corridor, though our guide, James, told us the indigenous people called it something else in their language that roughly translated to the devil's breath. Native folks won't come near this place. James explained as we hiked toward our designated campsite. Say the land itself is wrong, cursed or something like it. Geological anomalies often inspire folklore. Dr. Winters replied dismissively. They didn't have the scientific framework to explain what they were seeing. James just shook his head. Maybe, or maybe they knew something we don't. I remember noticing how quiet it was as we walked. No bird song. No rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just our footsteps and the occasional sound of wind through the trees. I mentioned this to Danny, who nodded grimly. Biodiversity drop-off is significant, she confirmed, making notes on her tablet. Should be teeming with life this time of year. We reached our campsite by late afternoon and set about establishing our base. The location was a small clearing beside a narrow stream, surrounded by dense spruce and hemlock trees. The rock formations we'd come to study were visible about half a mile further up the valley. Strange, spiraling columns of dark stone that seemed to twist upward from the earth like frozen tentacles. Those aren't natural, Marcus murmured as we all paused to observe them. No known geological process creates formations like that. That's why we're here, Dr. Winters reminded him, to document and explain what previous researchers couldn't. We finished setting up camp, prepared dinner, and discussed our research plan for the following day. As night fell, the first raindrops began to patter against our tents. A light drizzle would continue, with varying intensity, for the duration of our stay. Nothing unusual happened that first night, beyond the continuing silence that seemed to envelope the valley like a shroud. I slept fitfully, waking several times to the sound of rain, and an odd sensation of pressure in my ears, as if the altitude had suddenly changed. The strangeness began the next morning when we approached the rock formations. Up close, they were even more unsettling. Approximately 20 columns of black, glass-like stone, ranging from 6 to 15 feet in height, all twisted in a counterclockwise spiral. They were arranged in a rough circle, about 50 feet in diameter. This material isn't native to the region, I said after a preliminary examination. It's not igneous, metamorphic, or sedimentary, at least not in any conventional sense. Human-made, then? Dr. Winters suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. I don't think so. The crystalline structure is complex, unlike anything I've seen before. We spent the day taking samples, measurements, and photographs, working methodically around the circle of stones. The rain continued steadily, light but persistent, soaking through our gear despite our waterproof clothing. By late afternoon, we were all cold, wet, and increasingly unsettled by the formations we were studying. That evening, as we huddled in our communal tent, reviewing the day's findings, James made an observation that should have been our first warning. "The stones are oriented to true north," he said, looking at our map diagram, "and spaced at precise intervals. That's not natural. And there are exactly 13 of them," Danny added quietly. "I counted. 12, Marcus corrected. I mapped them all. Definitely 12. "No, 13, Danny insisted. "Count again." We pulled up the digital map Marcus had created. It showed 12 columns arranged in a perfect circle. "That's not right," I said, frowning. "There's one in the center as well." I took samples from it. "There's nothing in the center," Dr. Winters said, looking at me strangely. "It's an empty space. We all walked through it multiple times today." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with my damp clothes. I was absolutely certain there had been a central column, taller than the others, twisted more severely. I'd spent at least an hour examining it. "Maybe I'm thinking of one of the others," I conceded, though I didn't believe it for a moment. That night, I dreamed of the stone circle. In my dream, the columns were not stone at all, but enormous dark figures, twisted and frozen in postures of agony. They stood perfectly still, yet I somehow knew they were watching me. In the center of the circle, where the 13th column should have been, a pit open in the earth, a perfect circle of absolute darkness from which emanated a low, rhythmic sound like breathing. I woke with a start, my heart pounding, to find my tent illuminated by a flash of lightning. The rain had intensified into a proper storm, wind whipping the fabric of my shelter. Thunder rumbled overhead, and in the momentary silence that followed, I heard something else, a scraping sound, like stone dragging across stone, coming from the direction of the circle. I lay perfectly still listening. The sound came again, a grinding, grating noise that set my teeth on edge. Then footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through our camp. They paused outside my tent, and I watched in horror as a large shadow passed across the fabric, backlit by another flash of lightning. The shape was wrong, too tall, too thin, with proportions that didn't match any animal or human. The footsteps continued past my tent, toward the edge of our camp. A moment later, I heard Danny scream. I scrambled for my torch and boots, fumbling with the tent zipper in my panic. Outside, the rain lashed down in sheets, instantly soaking me as I stumbled toward the sound of scream. The other members of our team emerged from their tents as well, calling Danny's name. We found her tent empty, the entrance unzipped and flapping in the wind. Her sleeping bag was still there and her boots beside it, but no sign of Danny herself. "She wouldn't go out without her boots," Marcus said, his face pale in the beam of my torch. "Not in this rain." "Spread out," Dr. Winters ordered, pulling on her rain jacket. "She can't have gone far. Call out every 30 seconds, so we don't lose each other." We searched for hours, combing the area around our camp in ever-widening circles. The storm made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and the terrain was treacherous, slick with mud and hidden roots eager to trip the unwary. There was no sign of Danny. As dawn finally broke, bringing little improvement to visibility through continuing rain, we gathered back at camp to reassess. "We need to call for emergency extraction," James said, reaching for the satellite phone. "Get search and rescue teams in here." Dr. Winters nodded grimly, her usual composure shaken. "Try the park rangers first. They'll have protocols for missing persons in the area." James dialed, waited, then frowned. No signal. He moved to a different position and tried again. Nothing. That's strange. These phones are supposed to work anywhere. I felt a growing sense of dread. The storm might be interfering, I suggested, not believing in myself. I'm going to hike up to higher ground, James decided, already packing essential gear into his day pack. Better chance of getting a signal from the ridge. I'll come with you, Marcus volunteered. Nobody should be alone out here now. Dr. Winters agreed, and the two set off, promising to be back by nightfall at the latest. That left just me and Eliza at the camp, waiting anxiously as the hours crawled by. What do you think happened to her? I asked finally, voicing the question we'd all been avoiding. Dr. Winters stared into her cup of instant coffee, her expression unreadable. I don't know. Disorientation. Maybe. People do strange things when they panic. She could have heard something, gone to investigate, gotten lost. Without her boots? I pressed. And what would she have heard? There's nothing out here. No animals, no other people. There's something, Eliza said quietly. Last night, before Danny screamed, I heard it too. That scraping sound like stones moving. I thought I was dreaming that. I said, a chill running through me despite the thermal layers I wore. No, she replied. And I saw something. A shadow moving between the tents. Too tall to be human. We fell silent, the implications hanging between us like a physical presence. The rain continued its relentless patter against the tarp over our heads. By late afternoon, there was still no sign of James and Marcus. The light was already beginning to fade, a combination of the storm clouds and the early sunset of Alaskan autumn. They should have been back by now, I said, checking my watch for the dozenth time. We'll give them until full dark, Dr. Winters decided. Then we'll need to assume something's happened to them as well. And do what? I asked. If the satellite phone doesn't work, we're completely cut off. Hike out ourselves, she said grimly. First thing tomorrow, back to the landing zone. Hope the extraction team checks there when we miss our scheduled pickup in 12 days. The prospect was daunting. Miles of difficult terrain and continuing poor weather. For whatever had taken Danny, potentially hunting us as well. But the alternative, remaining in the valley waiting for help that might never come, was worse. We prepared what we could for the journey, packing only the essentials and abandoning the bulk of our research equipment. As night fell completely, we reluctantly accepted that James and Marcus would not be returning. We should take watches tonight, Dr. Winters suggested. 2 hours on, 2 off. I'll take first watch. I nodded, crawling into my tent with instructions to wake me in 2 hours. Despite my exhaustion, sleep was elusive. Every sound from the forest around us seemed amplified. The creak of branches in the wind, the splatter of heavy raindrops on leaves, and underneath it all, that faint grinding noise I'd heard the night before. I must have dozed off eventually, because I jerked awake to the sound of my name being called. Not by Dr. Winters, but by Danny. Hello? Her voice came again, from somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp. Is anyone there? I'm lost. Please help. I sat up, instantly alert. It was Danny's voice, unmistakably. But something about it seemed wrong. The inflection slightly off, the words too carefully enunciated. Eliza, I called softly, wondering why she hadn't responded to Danny's calls. No answer came from outside, where Dr. Winters should have been keeping watch. I'm hurt. Danny's voice called again, closer now. Please, I need help. I reached for my torch and rain jacket. Hesitating at the tent entrance, every instinct warned me not to go out there. But how could I ignore Danny if she was alive and needed help? Where are you? I called, unzipping the tent just enough to peer out. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and a quarter moon occasionally broke through the clouds, casting brief, dim light over our campsite. I could see the communal tent where Dr. Winters should have been keeping watch. Its entrance flap closed. "Here," Danny's voice replied, now coming from the edge of the trees. "Follow my voice. Hurry." I stepped out, sweeping my torch beam toward the voice. For an instant, I caught a glimpse of something at the forest edge. A tall, thin figure, distinctly not human. It moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, slipping between the trees before my light could fully illuminate it. "Danny," I called again, my voice shaking. Here, the voice answered, but different now, deeper with a hollow quality, as if speaking through a long tube. It was moving away, retreating into the forest. I ran to the communal tent, calling for Dr. Winters. When I received no response, I yanked open the flap to find it empty. Her torch lay on the ground, still switched on, casting a pool of light on her abandoned chair. Panic surged through me. I was alone now, completely alone in this silent, hostile valley. I spun around, torch beams slashing through the darkness, searching for any sign of Dr. Winters or the thing that had taken her. "Eliza!" I shouted, fear overriding caution. "Eliza, where are you?" "Here!" Came a reply from the forest, but it wasn't Eliza's voice or Danny's. It was that same hollow, resonant sound, now mimicking my own inflections. "Here, where are you?" Cold dread washed over me. The thing was learning, adapting its mimicry with each exchange. I backed toward my tent, intent on grabbing my emergency pack and running. Anywhere just away from here. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time, illuminated by a flash of lightning that silhouetted it against the trees. It stood easily 7 feet tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at odd angles. Its body seemed to be composed of the same black, glass-like material as the stone columns, but fluid somehow, shifting and flowing like half-melted wax. Where its face should have been was a blank, reflective surface that caught my torchlight and threw it back at me. It took a step forward, and I heard that grinding, scraping sound again, the noise of its movements as sections of its body grated against each other. It raised one elongated arm, the limbs stretching impossibly as it reached toward me across the clearing. I ran. No rational thought, no plan, just blind, animal panic propelling me away from the campsite into the forest. I crashed through undergrowth, stumbled over roots, scrambled up slopes, and slid down the other side, all while listening for the telltale scraping sound of pursuit. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead, finally collapsing against a fallen tree, gasping for breath. The rain had picked up again, soaking through my hastily donned jacket, plastering my hair and my skull. I had no idea where I was, which direction I'd come from, or where I should go. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to the camp. As my breathing slowed and my panic receded slightly, I became aware of my surroundings. The trees here were different, older, larger, with thick, gnarled trunks covered in pale, luminescent fungi that gave off a faint, ghostly glow. The ground was carpeted with spongy moss that seemed to absorb all sound, creating a pocket of profound silence broken only by the patter of rain. And directly in front of me, barely visible through the trees, stood one of the black stone columns. I froze, momentarily unsure if my panic flight had somehow led me in a circle back to the stone circle. But this column stood alone, and as I cautiously approached, I saw that it was different from those we'd been studying. This one was weathered, ancient, with deep grooves etched into its surface that formed patterns too regular to be natural erosion. They were symbols of some kind, similar to petroglyphs I'd seen in other regions, but unlike any specific style I could identify. I should have turned away, continued my flight in another direction, but professional curiosity temporarily overcame fear, and I stepped closer, tracing my torch beam over mysterious markings. They told a story. I realized, following the sequence of images that spiraled around the column from bottom to top. They depicted humanoid figures approaching similar spiral columns, then figures being taken by tall, thin entities. The final images showed the humans transforming, their bodies elongating and twisting until they too became columns of stone. With growing horror, I understood what we'd stumbled upon. The stone circle wasn't geological formation at all. It was a trap, and we'd walked right into it. A scraping sound behind me confirmed my worst fears. I whirled around to see the black, liquid stone creature standing at the edge of a small clearing. Its featureless face turned toward me. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It tilted its head at an impossible angle, as if considering the question. Then it spoke, not with Danny's voice or mine, but with a chorus of voices layered together. All my missing colleagues speaking in unison. "To become," it said, "to grow, to remember being human." It took a shambling step forward, its body flowing and reforming with each movement. "We were like you once," it continued, the voices separating and overlapping like a badly tuned radio. "Lost, curious, searching. Now we are found. Now we understand. Soon you will too." I backed away, bumping into the carved column behind me. "Where are my friends?" I demanded, playing for time as I searched desperately for an escape route. "Here," it replied, and for a moment its smooth face rippled, revealing glimpses of human features beneath. Danny's eyes, Marcus's mouth, James's nose, Eliza's brow, flowing together in a nightmarish collage before smoothing over again. All here, all part of the gathering. "The stone circle," I said, understanding dawning. "They're the columns. You turn them to stone." "Not stone," it corrected, taking another flowing step toward me. "Not dead, transformed, awakened. The circle grows, one by one. 13 becomes 14. 14 becomes more." I remembered my certainty about the 13th column, the one none of the others could see. Had that been one of us already? A previous expedition member, perhaps transformed and waiting? "Were you?" I asked, my back pressed against the carved column. Nowhere left to retreat. "We are the first people," it said. "The ones who discovered how to transcend flesh, how to become living stone, eternal, patient. We slept beneath this valley for millennia, until your kind came with machines that disturbed our sleep. Now we wake. Now we remember. Now we grow again." It was less than a meter away now, close enough that I could see my own reflection fractured across its featureless face. One arm extended toward me, fingers elongating into sharp, crystalline points. "Join us," the chorus of voices invited. "Become eternal." In that moment of absolute terror, I did the only thing I could think of. I swung my torch as hard as possible at the creature's head. To my surprise, the impact produced a sound like breaking glass, and cracks spread across its featureless face. It recoiled, making a high-pitched keening sound that set my teeth on edge. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted past it, running blindly through the forest once more. Behind me, I heard that terrible scraping sound again, faster now, angry. The creature was pursuing, no longer patient or conversational. I don't know how long I ran, or how far. The rain intensified into a downpour, turning the forest floor into a treacherous maze of mud and hidden obstacles. Several times I fell, each time forcing myself back to my feet through sheer terror-fueled determination. The sounds of pursuit sometimes seemed to fade, only to resume closer than before, as if the creature was toying with me, herding me in a specific direction. Eventually, I broke through the trees into a familiar clearing, our camp. I'd somehow run in a circle again, ending up exactly where I'd started. My tent still stood where I'd left it, alongside the abandoned shelters of my colleagues. In the center of the clearing, dimly visible through the rain, stood a new stone column, black and spiraling, exactly like those in the circle. As I watched in horror, the column began to change, the surface flowing and shifting until it took on Dr. Winter's silhouette, frozen in a posture of terror and pain. Then it solidified again, becoming just another twisted column of black stone. Movement at the edge of the clearing drew my attention. The creature emerged in the trees, but it was different now. Larger, its form incorporating elements that seemed horrifyingly familiar. I recognized Danny's distinctive curly hair and the texture of one arm, Marcus's broad shoulders and his upper torso, James's beard-like patterns across what passed for its chest. "Now, you," it said, its voice a melange of my friends' voices layered together. "Complete the gathering." It surged toward me with surprising speed, no longer shambling, but flowing like a wave of black glass across the clearing. I turned to flee once more, but my foot caught on a tent peg, sending me sprawling face first into the mud. I rolled onto my back just as the creature loomed over me, its liquid stone body beginning to flow around mine, encasing my legs in cold, heavy blackness that burned like acid where it touched bare skin. I screamed, thrashing uselessly as the substance continued to creep upward, covering my torso, reaching for my face. "Become," the voices whispered as the blackness covered my chest, constricting around my ribs like a vice. "Transcend. Remember." In desperation, I grabbed the only weapon at hand, a metal tent stake that had pulled free from the ground in my fall. As the living stone reached my neck, I drove the stake into the center of the creature's featureless face with all my remaining strength. The effect was instantaneous and unexpected. The creature recoiled with a shriek that sounded like shattering glass, the black substance withdrawing from my body with a painful tearing sensation. It stumbled backward, claw at the stake protruding from its face, its form losing cohesion, melting and reforming like wax in a flame. I scrambled to my feet, expecting it to recover and resume its attack at any moment. Instead, it continued to thrash and shriek, its body flowing in conflicting directions as if multiple entities within it were suddenly fighting for control. With a final discordant howl, it collapsed into a shapeless puddle of black, glass-like material that quickly hardened into an amorphous lump. I didn't wait to see if the effect was permanent. I grabbed my emergency pack from my tent and ran, choosing a direction at random and sticking to it regardless of terrain or obstacles. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between myself and that accursed valley. I walked through the night and the following day, stopping only when exhaustion forced brief rests. The rain continued unabated, sometimes lessening to a drizzle, other times intensifying into a downpour that reduced visibility to mere feet. I had no idea if I was heading toward extraction or deeper into the wilderness, but anything seemed better than staying near the stone circle and its guardians. On the third day after my escape, I stumbled out of the forest onto a gravel road, a service route used by park rangers. Hours later, a maintenance truck found me walking along the shoulder, delirious with exhaustion and exposure. They rushed me to the nearest medical facility, where I spent several days recovering from hypothermia, dehydration, and a host of minor injuries. I told the authorities a simplified version of events, that our team had been separated in a storm, that I'd gotten lost trying to find help. I mentioned nothing about living stone creatures or transforming columns. They conducted a search of the area based on my vague directions, but found no trace of our camp or my colleagues. The official report concluded that they had likely perished due to exposure or fall in the difficult terrain, their bodies washed away by the heavy rains and flooding that had occurred during that period. I let them believe it. What else could I do? The truth would have sounded like the ravings of a madman. But I know what I saw. I know what happened to my friends, and I fear they remain in that valley still, frozen in columns of living stone, conscious and aware for all eternity. Sometimes in my nightmares, I hear their voices calling to me, begging me to return, to join them to complete the gathering. And there's something else, something I haven't told anyone, not even the doctors who treated me. Since that night, I've discovered small patches of strange, glass-like material growing on my skin, black, reflective spots that appear and disappear seemingly at random. I cut one out once, watching in horror as it melted into a tiny puddle before hardening again. I've taken to wearing long sleeves and gloves regardless of weather, afraid of what someone might see. Sometimes, when it rains and I catch my reflection in a window or mirror, I think I see someone else looking back. Not just me, but aspects of Danny, of Marcus, of James and Eliza, all flowing together beneath my features. In those moments, I hear whispers and the sound of raindrops, promises that I haven't truly escaped, that the transformation has already begun, that eventually I will return to the circle to take my place among the columns. So I offer this account as both confession and warning. If you find yourself in the Chugach National Forest, and you encounter a circle of twisted black columns rising from the earth like frozen tentacles, turn around. Leave immediately. Don't take samples. Don't take photographs. Don't even look at them for too long. And if, on a rainy night in the wilderness, you hear the voices of friends calling for help from the darkness between trees, ignore them. Run. Run as far and as fast as you can. And pray to whatever God you believe in that the things that live in the devil's corridor haven't already set their sights on you. Because they're patient, these living stone beings. They've waited thousands of years already. They can wait a little longer for you to join their gathering. Are you listening to this in the rain? Can you hear anything unusual in the pattern of drops against your window? Listen carefully. That rhythm, that almost voice whispering your name, it's how it begins. It's how they find you. It's how they call you home. I need someone to know what happened, just in case. Just in case I don't. Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I've been a wildlife photographer for nearly 15 years, specializing in capturing images of North American predators in their natural habitats. Bears, wolves, mountain lions. I photograph them all, often spending weeks alone in remote wilderness areas for the perfect shot. My work has been featured in National Geographic, BBC Wildlife, and countless conservation publications. I tell you this not a boast, but so you'll understand that I'm experienced. I know the wilderness. I know animal behavior. And I know the difference between natural and unnatural. What I encountered in the Chugach National Forest 3 weeks ago was decidedly unnatural. The rain is falling heavily tonight, much like it was at night. I find the sound both soothing and terrifying now. A reminder how thin the barrier is between our safe, ordered world and whatever exists beyond it. The space where it waits, watching, always watching. But I should start from the beginning. I've been commissioned to capture images of the elusive coastal brown bears of Alaska, a subspecies of grizzly that grows larger than its inland cousins due to the protein-rich salmon diet available near the coast. The Chugach National Forest, with its mixture of dense woodland and salmon-rich streams, provides ideal habitat for these magnificent creatures. I arrived in early September, when the salmon run was in full swing, and the bears were actively feeding to build fat reserves for winter hibernation. After consulting with local rangers about recent bear activity, I selected a remote area near Eagle River, about 25 miles from the nearest frequented trail. I wanted authenticity, bears behaving naturally without human interference. My plan was simple but effective, refined through years of experience. I would set up a series of trail cameras along game paths and near streams, capturing continuous footage that would reveal natural bear movements and behavior. Meanwhile, I would establish a blind at a strategic location for my own photography, maintaining a safe distance while using telephoto lenses to get the intimate shots I needed. The hike to my chosen area took 2 full days, the terrain growing increasingly rugged as I moved deeper into the wilderness. I noticed the usual signs of bear presence: scat, scratched trees, partially eaten salmon. But also something unusual: areas where the undergrowth had been flattened in perfect circles, as if something heavy had been resting there. Not typical bear behavior. But I rationalized it as perhaps the work of moose or other large wildlife. By the afternoon of the third day, I'd reached my destination, a small clearing beside a narrow, rapid-flowing stream that showed ample evidence of bear fishing activity. I set up my tent on higher ground about a quarter-mile away, carefully store my food in bear-proof containers suspended from trees well away from where I would sleep. Basic precautions for bear country. The first 3 days passed uneventfully as I established my blind and positioned 12 trail cameras at strategic locations. The weather was typical for Alaskan autumn: cool, overcast, with frequent light rain that occasionally intensified into proper downpours. I caught glimpses of wildlife: a young black bear one morning, a fox slipping through the underbrush, numerous eagles overhead. But the large coastal browns remained elusive. On the fourth night, the rain intensified into a proper storm. I retreated to my tent early, reviewing the day's photographs on my laptop as thunder rolled across the mountains and rain pelted against the nylon shell of my tent. Around midnight, exhausted from the day's hiking, I fell asleep to the rhythmic drumming of raindrops. I woke abruptly several hours later, immediately alert in the way that comes from years of sleeping in wilderness environments. Something had changed. The rain continued steadily, but underneath it was another sound, a heavy, deliberate movement outside my tent. My first thought was bear, but the rhythm was wrong. Bears move with a lumbering gait, distinctive and unmistakable. This was something else, something that walked with measured, almost precise cadence. I lay perfectly still, controlling my breathing as I listened intently. The footsteps, if that's what they were, circled my tent slowly, pausing occasionally before continuing their methodical circuit. After completing what seemed to be a full circle, they stopped directly in front of the entrance. I reached slowly for my bear spray, my hand closing around the canister as I waited, heart pounding in my chest. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. Then, something pressed against the side of my tent. Not a paw or a snout, but something that spread across the fabric like a hand. Fingers splayed wide, too wide for a human hand. The impression clearly visible against the nylon. "Hello?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "Is someone there?" No response came, but the hand-like impression withdrew. The footsteps resumed, moving away from my tent and into the forest. I listened until they faded entirely before releasing the breath I'd been holding. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat up for the remainder of the night, bear spray in one hand, satellite phone in the other, though I didn't call for extraction. I told myself it was probably just another hiker who'd gotten lost in the storm, or perhaps a ranger checking on backcountry campers. The fact that they hadn't responded to my greeting was unsettling, but not necessarily sinister. Dawn brought clearing skies and that peculiar freshness that follows a night of heavy rain. I emerged cautiously from my tent, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of my nighttime visitor. The ground was soft from the rain, and there, clearly visible in the mud around my tent, were footprints. They were unmistakably human in basic shape. A heel, an arch, 5 toes, but disturbingly wrong in their proportions. Too large. The toes too long and widely spaced, the balls of the feet too pronounced. They formed a perfect circle around my tent, exactly as I'd heard the footsteps move during the night, ending at a point directly in front of the entrance where a deeper impression suggested my visitor had stood for some time. I photographed the prints from multiple angles, including several with my boot placed beside them for scale. My size 11 hiking boot looked like a child's footwear in comparison. As unsettling as the discovery was, I wasn't ready to abandon my assignment. I'd invested too much time, and traveled too far to leave without the photographs I needed. I rationalized that Alaska hosts all manner of unusual wildlife, perhaps even an undocumented primate species, though I knew how far-fetched that sounded even as I thought it. I decided to check my trail cameras. If something strange was wandering these woods, perhaps I caught on film. The first camera, positioned at the edge of the clearing near my tent, had been triggered multiple times during the night. The initial images showed nothing unusual, just rain-swept forest illuminated by the camera's infrared flash. Then at 2:17 a.m., something appeared at the edge of the frame. A tall, dark figure standing just beyond the camera's main focus area. The image was blurry, the figure partially obscured by foliage, but it appeared to be watching my tent from the tree line. Subsequent images showed it moving closer, always remaining partially hidden, as if it understood the camera's field of view and was deliberately avoiding full exposure. The final image, time-stamped 2:43 a.m., showed only a close-up of what might have been an eye, large, featureless, and black as obsidian, filling nearly the entire frame. The camera had recorded no further images after that, though it should have continued functioning through the night. With growing unease, I moved to check the second camera, positioned along the game trail about a quarter mile from my campsite. This one had also triggered multiple times, but all images after 3:12 a.m. showed the same scene, empty forest, as if the camera had been triggered, but whatever caused the trigger had managed to move out of frame before the shutter activated. The third camera was missing entirely, the tree where I'd secured it showing only bare bark and the broken plastic mount. The fourth camera had captured something extraordinary. At 3:27 a.m., it recorded a series of 3 images showing a figure walking directly toward the lens. The figure was humanoid but wrong in ways that made my skin crawl, impossibly tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its torso. It appeared to be naked, its skin a pale, mottled gray in the infrared lighting. Its face was only partially visible, but what I could see resembled neither human nor animal, a smooth, almost featureless visage with deep-set eyes that reflected the camera's flashlight mirrors. The final image from this camera showed only static, as if the device had malfunctioned immediately afterward. I worked my way through the remaining cameras with mounting dread. 2 more were missing entirely. One had been damaged, its casing cracked open and the memory card removed. The other showed similar patterns, glimpses of the tall figure at the edges of frames, moments of static or inexplicable gaps in the recording timeline. The last camera, positioned near the stream where I'd seen evidence of bear activity, had captured something different. At 4:02 a.m., it recorded not the tall figure, but a bear, a massive coastal brown, easily 700 pounds, wading into the stream. As the bear turned toward the camera, something emerged from the tree line behind it, the same tall, pale figure from the other images. The bear, seemingly unaware of the entity's presence, continued fishing. In the next frame, the figure was close to the bear, one elongated arm extended toward the animal. The bear appeared frozen, its posture unnatural, as if caught in mid-movement. The final image showed the figure bent over the now prostrate bear, one hand pressed against the animal's head. The bear's eyes were open but empty, reflecting the camera's flash like glass marbles. I sat beside the stream for a long time, staring at that last image on my camera's display screen. Whatever this thing was, it had subdued, perhaps killed, a full-grown coastal brown bear without apparent effort, and it had been systematically checking, disabling, or removing my trail cameras throughout the night. It knew what they were, it understood what they did, and it had visited my tent. The rational decision would have been to pack up immediately and hike out, to report my findings to the park rangers or wildlife authorities. But I'd spent my career pursuing the elusive, the unexplained, the boundary between the known natural world and its less documented corners. This was potentially the discovery of a lifetime, evidence of an undocumented species, of extraordinary intelligence and physical capability. So I made the decision that I've regretted every day since. I stayed. I repositioned my remaining functional cameras, this time hiding them more carefully, camouflaging them with local vegetation, placing them higher in trees, angling them to cover each other's positions. I set up a new blind closer to my tent, planning to conduct a nighttime observation vigil. I loaded my camera with high-speed film suitable for low-light conditions and attached my most sensitive telephoto lens. As dusk approached, bringing with another wave of rain, I settled into my blind, camera ready, bear spray and satellite phone within easy reach. The forest darkened quickly under the overcast sky, and soon I was peering into near total blackness, broken only by the occasional distant flash of lightning. The rain intensified as night deepened, drumming against the canvas of my blind, creating a white noise that both soothed and unsettled me. Hours passed with no sign of anything unusual. I checked my watch just after midnight. I would give it until dawn, I decided, and if nothing appeared, I would leave first thing in the morning, taking my evidence with me. That's when I heard it. A sound so subtle, it was almost lost beneath the rain. A deliberate footstep, then another, moving slowly but directly toward my blind. I raised my camera, peering through the viewfinder as I angled it toward the sound. For several heartbeats, nothing was visible in the darkness. Then, silhouetted against a distant lightning flash, I saw it, the figure from the trail camera images, standing at the edge of the clearing, its impossible height and proportions even more disturbing in person. It remained perfectly still, as if listening or scenting the air. I adjusted my camera settings with trembling fingers and pressed the shutter release. The flash illuminated the clearing for a split second, and in that frozen moment, I saw the creature clearly for the first time. It stood at least 8 feet tall, its body unnaturally thin and pale, almost skeletal, with joints that bent at odd angles. Its arms hung nearly to its knees, ending in hands with elongated fingers tipped with what looked like dark claws or talons. Its legs were equally disproportionate, bent backward at the knee like a bird's. But its face, God, its face was what haunted my nightmares in the days that followed. It had no features that could be called a nose or mouth, just smooth, grayish skin stretched over a vaguely skull-like structure, where eyes should have been were two large, perfectly circular black orbs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and spanning its forehead was a row of smaller orbs, 5 or 6 of them, arranged in a neat horizontal line like additional eyes. The flash seemed to startle it. It jerked backward, raising one arm as if to shield itself from the light. Then it was gone, moving with such speed that it seemed to simply vanish from the clearing. I sat frozen in my blind, camera clutched to my chest, heart hammering against my ribs. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? Could any natural creature move with such unnatural speed? I had my answer moments later, when something struck the back of my blind with enough force to collapse the entire structure, sending poles and canvas crashing down upon me. I thrashed beneath the heavy material, disoriented and panicked, finally freeing myself only to find myself face to face with the creature. It stood less than 3 feet away, regarding me with those black, featureless eyes. This close, I could see other details I'd missed. The skin wasn't smooth but covered in fine, almost translucent filaments like moss or mold. It had no visible ears, but the side of its head pulsed with what might have been gill-like structures, and though it had no apparent mouth, the lower portion of its face rippled occasionally, as if something moved beneath the skin. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think coherently. Some primal part of my brain recognized that I was in the presence of a perfect predator, and that any movement might trigger an attack. Then, slowly, it extended one long-fingered hand toward me. The fingers were wrong. Too many joints, too fluid in their movement, like tentacles with bones. The tip of one finger touched my forehead, feather-like, and a sensation like ice water flowing into my brain made me gasp. Images flashed behind my eyes, fragmented, alien perceptions that made no sense to my human consciousness. I saw the forest from impossible heights, through visual spectrums no human I could perceive. I felt the sensation of moving through trees faster than any land animal could manage, of perceiving the electrical impulses of nearby organisms like visible auras. And beneath it all, a hunger so profound and alien defied human understanding. Not for flesh or blood, but for something else, something more fundamental. The contact lasted only moments before the creature withdrew its hand. I collapsed to my knees, overcome by vertigo and nausea. When I looked up again, it was watching me with what I could only interpret as curiosity. Its head tilted slightly to one side. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible even to myself. The creature made no sound, but another flood of images filled my mind. Birds frozen mid-flight, insects paused between wing beats, fish suspended in flowing water, and humans, dozens of them, in various poses of fear or flight, all perfectly preserved, like photographs of moments that should have passed but somehow didn't. Then I understood. It collected moments, frozen instants of time, like my photographs, but dimensional, permanent. And it wanted my camera, my images, my technology, not out of fear of discovery, but out of professional curiosity. One collector recognizing another. Slowly, my hand shaking, I held out my camera. The creature regarded it for a moment, then took it with surprising gentleness, turning it over in those long fingers, examining every aspect of its construction. After a thorough inspection, it handed the camera back to me. It then turned, moving toward the tree line with that same unnatural gait. At the edge of the clearing, it paused and looked back. A final image appeared in my mind, a map of sorts, showing a path through the forest, leading away from this place. A clear message, leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I broke camp at first light, abandoning non-essential equipment in my haste to be gone. The hike out, which had taken 2 days on the way in, I completed in a single grueling 18-hour march, driven by a bone-deep certainty that I needed to put as much distance as possible between myself and that clearing. I reported nothing to the park rangers or wildlife authorities. What could I say? That I'd encountered a cryptid species? That I'd communicated telepathically with an unknown predator? I'd be dismissed as delusional, possibly barred from future work in national parks. Instead, I claimed equipment failure, and poor weather had cut my trip short, and I returned to the city, to civilization, to safety. Or so I thought. The photographs I took that night shouldn't exist. When I connected my camera to my computer, I expected to find the one clear image I'd captured a creature. Instead, I found hundreds detailed, perfect images of the entity from every angle, in various poses throughout the forest. Images I never took. Images that couldn't possibly exist. And in the background of several photographs, barely visible in the shadows, were human figures. Hikers, campers, rangers, all frozen in postures of surprise or terror, their eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams. All photographed by something that understood cameras, but not their limitations, that collected moments as I collected images. Most disturbing of all was a final photograph in the sequence, a picture of me, asleep in my tent, taken from inside, from an angle that would require a photographer to be standing over me. My eyes are closed, my expression peaceful, unaware of the looming presence capturing my vulnerability. I deleted them all immediately, but it didn't matter. Each night since my return, I wake at precisely 3:27 a.m., the timestamp on that four-trail camera, to the sound of deliberate footsteps circling my bedroom. Sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, I see those black, featureless eyes watching me from the corner of the room, and feel the weight of a collector's interest in my most private moments. It followed me home, or perhaps it was always here, always watching, and I simply became aware of it because I intruded upon its hunting grounds, because I attempted to capture it as it captures others. Last night, I woke to find my camera, which I had placed on my dresser before going to bed, sitting on my nightstand instead, lens pointed directly at me. The power indicator light was on, though I distinctly remembered turning it off. When I checked the memory card this morning, I found a new photograph, my own sleeping face, taken from above, with what appears to be an elongated, pale finger just visible at the edge of the frame. I'm leaving tonight, driving south, as far from Alaska as I can manage. I don't know if distance will make a difference, if this entity is bound by the normal limitations of physical space. But I have to try. I share this account not as a warning to stay away from the Chugach National Forest, though that would be prudent, but as documentation. If something happens to me, if I simply disappear like those figures in the photographs, at least someone will know why. Someone will know what's out there, watching, collecting, preserving moments that should have passed but somehow remain frozen in its impossible gallery. For those who venture into remote wilderness with cameras, who seek to capture the natural world in images, be careful what you photograph, and be even more careful of what might be photographing you. Listen, do you hear that? That subtle click beneath the sound of rainfall? The whisper of a shutter opening and closing? Perhaps it's just my imagination, my nerves frayed from weeks of interrupted sleep and constant vigilance. Or perhaps you're being added to the collection right now, this very moment, as you listen to my story. A perfect, permanent record of your fear, preserved for an audience you cannot comprehend. Look around you. Are you sure you're alone? I wasn't always afraid of the fog. Growing up in Seattle, it was simply part of life, a familiar blanket that softened the city's hard edges and lent an air of mystery to ordinary mornings. But that was before Chugach, before I learned that some fog isn't fog at all, but something far more ancient and hungry, something that thinks, something that hunts. The sound of rain against my window brings it all back. It's been 8 months since my trip to Alaska, but on nights like this, with water streaming down glass and shadows pooling in corners, I can still feel it searching for me. Can still hear the whispers that aren't quite whispers. Are you listening to this in the dark? Perhaps with rain falling outside? You might want to turn on a light. Check that what you're seeing outside is really just ordinary weather, just to be sure. I should start at the beginning. I was a graduate student researching microclimate variations in temperate rainforests. My thesis focused on how subtle changes in temperature, humidity, and air pressure can create distinct ecological niches within relatively small geographical areas. The Chugach National Forest, with its unique positioning between coastal influences and inland mountain systems, represented an ideal study environment. I'd spent 2 years gathering data across various locations in the Pacific Northwest, but Alaska offered something special, pristine watersheds relatively untouched by human development, where I could observe natural patterns without accounting for urban heat islands or industrial pollutants. My plan was straightforward. 2 weeks at a remote research station in the heart of Chugach, deploying a network of environmental sensors throughout a 5-mile radius, gathering baseline data on temperature fluctuations, humidity levels, air pressure changes, and precipitation patterns. I would have preferred to conduct my research during summer, but funding and scheduling constraints meant an October expedition. Not ideal, but still workable. I flew into Anchorage, rented a sturdy 4x4, and drove the winding road to the research station, a small, well-equipped cabin maintained by the university for various scientific endeavors. The station sat on a small plateau overlooking a valley, providing excellent visibility of the surrounding forest and weather patterns, while remaining accessible via an unpaved service road. The first 3 days passed uneventfully as I established my baseline equipment and began preliminary data collection. The weather was typical for Alaskan autumn, cool with intermittent light rain and swiftly moving cloud systems. I settled into a comfortable routine. Mornings spent checking and adjusting equipment. Afternoons hiking to deploy new sensors or collect data from those already in place. Evenings analyzing results and updating my research notes. On the 4th day, the weather forecast called for increased precipitation and dropping temperatures. Nothing severe, just a typical autumn storm system moving through the region. I decided to use the opportunity to gather data on how rapidly changing weather conditions affected the various microclimates I was studying. I spent that morning hiking to my furthest monitoring station, approximately 4 miles east of the cabin, situated near a small lake. The clouds grew heavier as I worked, the light rain intensifying into a steady downpour by early afternoon. I finished my adjustments and began to hike back, noting the rapidly changing conditions with professional interest. About halfway back to the cabin, I noticed something unusual, a patch of dense fog forming in a small valley to my north. Fog formation wasn't unusual in itself, but the speed with which this particular mass materialized caught my attention. Within minutes, what had been clear air became a solid wall of gray-white vapor, expanding rapidly across the landscape. As a scientist, I was intrigued. This was precisely the kind of microclimate phenomenon I was studying. A localized weather event triggered by specific terrain and atmospheric conditions. I altered my course slightly to approach the edge of the fog bank, thinking I might gather some useful observational data. As I drew closer, I noticed something odd about this fog. Most naturally occurring fog has a certain translucence to it. You can generally see at least a few feet into it, with visibility gradually diminishing with distance. This fog, however, appeared completely opaque, with a sharp, defined boundary between clear air and impenetrable whiteness. More unsettling still, it appeared to be unusually dark for fog, not white or gray, but a deep, sooty black at its center, fading to dark gray at its edges. I paused about 20 feet from the boundary, suddenly hesitant. Something about this fog didn't feel right. It didn't move the way fog should move, didn't dissipate and reform the edges with the breeze. Instead, it seemed to pulse slightly, the outer boundary rippling in a rhythmic pattern that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing. Scientific curiosity warred with instinctive caution. I removed my atmospheric sensor from my pack, a handheld device that measured temperature, humidity, air pressure, and several other environmental factors. Holding it at arm's length, I approached the fog's edge, intending to take readings from just outside its boundary. As I drew within 10 feet of the fog, my sensor began to malfunction, the display flickering and showing impossible readings, temperature dropping to near absolute zero, then spiking to hundreds of degrees Celsius, humidity fluctuating between 0% and 100% in seconds, air pressure readings that would have crushed a submarine or represented the vacuum of space. I stopped, staring at the device in confusion. It was high-quality scientific equipment, rigorously tested and calibrated. It shouldn't be failing like this, not unless it was being subjected to conditions far beyond its design parameters. I looked up from the sensor to find that the fog had moved closer, though I hadn't seen it advance. What had been 10 feet away was now barely 5 feet from where I stood, and it had changed. The dark center seemed larger, the pulsing more pronounced. As I watched, frozen in place by a combination of scientific fascination and growing unease, tendrils of mist began to extend from the main mass, reaching toward me like probing fingers. That was when I heard it, a sound coming from within the fog. Not wind, not the rustle of wildlife, but something that chilled me to my core. Whispers, dozens, perhaps hundreds of overlapping whispers, too faint to distinguish words, but unmistakably human in cadence and tone. My scientific detachment shattered. Whatever this was, it wasn't a natural weather phenomenon. I backed away slowly, unwilling to turn my back on the advancing tendrils, which seemed to reach more urgently as I retreated. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and now I could almost make out words, my name among them, repeated with increasing urgency. I had backed perhaps 20 feet when my heel caught on a root, sending me sprawling backward onto the wet forest floor. In the moment it took me to regain my bearings, the fog surged forward, covering half the distance between us in an instant, those dark tendrils extending further, faster. I abandoned all pretense of calm observation, scrambling to my feet and running full tilt away from the fog, back toward the cabin. I didn't look back until I'd covered at least a quarter mile, my lungs burning with exertion. When I finally did turn, I expected to see that I'd outpaced it, that the strange fog remained in the valley where I first observed it. Instead, I saw it following, not drifting as fog should, but flowing like water uphill, maintaining a consistent distance behind me. It had expanded, too, spreading outward to fill the space between trees, advancing in a solid wall of darkness, split only by those reaching tendrils. I ran faster. The rain pelted my face, my pack bouncing painfully against my back. The rational part of my mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Perhaps it was an unusual weather pattern driven by the specific geography of the region. Perhaps it was smoke from a forest fire behaving strangely in the rain. But the primal part of me, the part that recognizes predators on a level beyond conscious thought, knew better. This thing was hunting me. I covered the remaining 2 miles to the cabin in what must have been record time, fueled by adrenaline and fear. As I burst through the door and slammed it behind me, I caught a glimpse of the fog reaching the edge of the clearing, stopping at the tree line as if hesitant to cross open ground. Safe inside, I paced the cabin's main room, trying to calm my racing heart and make sense of what I'd witnessed. My scientific training demanded rational explanation, but every attempt fell short. I found myself repeatedly drawn to the windows, watching as the fog lingered at the forest edge, tendrils occasionally extending a few feet into the clearing before withdrawing. As daylight faded into evening, the fog remained, now completely surrounding the cabin, a dark wall marking the boundary between forest and clearing. I tried the satellite phone, thinking I should report the unusual phenomenon, but found no signal. Unusual, as the system was designed to function in remote areas regardless of weather conditions. Night fell, and still the fog waited. I kept all lights burning, unwilling to sit in darkness with that thing watching from outside. Around midnight, as the rain intensified into a proper storm, I noticed a change. The fog was advancing, slowly creeping across the clearing toward the cabin. It moved in stops and starts, gaining a few feet, pausing, then advancing again. I moved frantically through the cabin, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was sealed. As I passed the east-facing window, I noticed something that stopped me cold, shapes in the fog. Human silhouettes walking slowly within the dark mass, their forms visible only as deeper shadows within the blackness. As I stared, one figure separated from the others, approaching the edge of the fog nearest the cabin. It was the outline of a man, featureless except for his shape, walking with an odd, stumbling gait. It stopped at the very boundary where fog met clear air, turned its blank face toward my window, and raised an arm in what might have been greeting or beckoning. The whispers returned then, louder now, filtering through the walls as if carried by the rain itself. My name, over and over, interspersed with fragments I couldn't quite catch. Words about joining, about becoming, about surrendering to fog. I retreated to the center of the cabin, away from windows and doors, clutching my satellite phone and attempting calls that never connected. Outside, More figures emerged from the fog, dozens of them, all with that same stumbling gait, all stopping at the boundary, all raising arms toward the cabin, toward me. By 2 a.m., the fog had reached the cabin walls, pressing against the structure like a living thing, probing windows and the space beneath doors. The whispers were constant now, a maddening chorus of voices calling my name, promising relief from fear if only I would open the door, step outside, become one with the fog. I was certain that if the fog found a way inside, I would die, or worse, become like those shadowy figures, forever wandering within its darkness. I barricaded myself in the bathroom, the only room without windows, pressing towels against the door's edge to block the tendrils of mist that had begun seeping through the gap. The hours passed with excruciating slowness. I sat with my back against the bathtub, listening to the whispers grow more insistent, more angry as dawn approached. Occasionally, something would scratch at the bathroom door, not with the randomness of mist moved by air currents, but with deliberate, almost human movements. When sunlight finally filtered through the small bathroom window, the whispers faded and scratching stopped. I waited another hour before cautiously opening the door. The cabin was empty, untouched except for thin trails of black residue marking where tendrils of fog had crept beneath doors and windows. Outside, the fog had retreated to the tree lean, once again forming a wall around the clearing. But now I could see it clearly in daylight, not white or gray like natural fog, but a deep, sooty black shot through with swirls of dark purple and green, like oil on water. And still, moving within it, those human silhouettes, pacing restlessly at its edge, occasionally turning blank faces toward the cabin. I knew I couldn't stay another night. Whatever scientific discovery I might make by studying this phenomenon wasn't worth the risk. I gathered my essential research materials, some food and water, and plotted a path to my vehicle, parked about half a mile away on the service road. The fog encircled the entire clearing, but appeared thinnest to the west, the direction of the road. I left at mid-morning, when the sun was at its highest, hoping that daylight might suppress whatever power drove the fog. As I stepped outside, the whispers immediately returned, and the fog at the tree lean rippled with increased activity, those human shapes moving more frantically, more purposefully. I crossed the clearing at a run, making for the thin section of fog I'd identified. As I approached, the black mass roiled and thickened, those shadowy figures converging on my intended exit point. I changed direction, angling toward a different section, but the fog responded, shifting to block me. It was intelligent, I realized with dawning horror. Not just alive, but calculating, capable of anticipating my movements and countering them. This wasn't a weather phenomenon. It was a predator. In desperation, I unclipped my emergency flare from my belt, struck it, and hurled it directly into the densest concentration of fog ahead of me. The bright red flame arced through the air and disappeared into the blackness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the fog where the flare had entered suddenly rippled violently, pulling back from the point of impact with what sounded horribly like a scream. Not human, but not animal either. A sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A gap appeared in the wall of blackness, small, rapidly closing, but large enough. I didn't hesitate, diving through the opening and rolling onto the wet forest floor beyond. Behind me, the fog surged forward, tendrils whipping through the air where I had been moments before. I ran without looking back, following the rough path to the service road. The whispers pursued me, louder and angrier than before, occasionally coalescing into partial phrases I could almost understand. Promises of pain, of eternal wandering, of a hunger that would never be satisfied. I reached my vehicle, fumbled the key into the ignition, and accelerated down the muddy road fast enough to fishtail dangerously on the slick surface. In my rear-view mirror, I saw the fog pouring from the forest onto the road, Advancing far faster than any natural mist could move, those human silhouettes running at its leading edge with those same stumbling, wrong gaits. I drove recklessly, pushing the 4x4 to its limits on the winding forest road, watching the fog gradually recede in my mirrors until, about 5 miles from the research station, it stopped abruptly, as if it had reached the limit of its territory. The whispers faded, replaced by the normal sound of engine and rain. I reported the incident when I reached Anchorage, describing it as an unusual weather phenomenon that had made continuation of my research impossible. I mentioned nothing about whispers or figures in the fog, nothing about its apparent intelligence or malevolence. Such claims would have ended my academic career before it properly began. In the months since, I researched similar incidents, reports of black fog or living mist in remote areas, particularly in old-growth forests in the northern latitudes. Most accounts are dismissed as superstition or misidentification of natural phenomena, but some contain details too specific, too similar to my experience to be coincidence. Indigenous peoples of the region have stories of the breast stealer or shadow mist, an entity that appears as black fog and consumes unwary travelers, adding their essences to its collective consciousness. Those taken by the fog are said to wander within it forever, their silhouettes sometimes visible to those outside, their voices used to lure new victims. Scientists who study these legends suggest they're metaphorical warnings about getting lost in fog or succumbing to hypothermia, which can cause confusion and hallucinations. A rational explanation, certainly, but one that fails to account for what I witnessed. The fog's apparent intelligence, its ability to coordinate movement, the reality of those whispering voices. I abandoned my thesis on microclimate variations. Some curiosities are better left unexplored. I accepted a teaching position at a small university in Arizona, about as far from fog and rain as I could manage while still pursuing my career. I've convinced myself most days that what I experienced was some combination of unusual weather conditions and stress-induced hallucination. But on nights like this, when rain streams down windows and shadows deepening corners, I'm not so certain. Because sometimes in the sound of rainfall, I hear whispers again, my name, called in multiple overlapping voices, followed by a promise that the fog is patient, that it remembers me, that someday, somewhere, I'll encounter a black mist on a rainy evening and rejoin those wandering silhouettes. And sometimes, when I pass through an early morning fog bank on my rare visits to damper climates, I glimpse movement at the corner of my eye, stumbling human-shaped shadows that vanish when viewed directly. I tell myself with imagination, the power of suggestion playing tricks on an overactive mind. But a part of me knows better. A part of me understands that the black fog of Chugach was merely one manifestation of something far older and more widespread, a consciousness that exists in the spaces between air molecules and the condensation of water vapor, in the boundary between seen and unseen. It's out there still, patiently waiting. And on nights like this, with rain pattering against windows and normal fog condensing on glass, I check and recheck that all openings are sealed, all gaps covered. I leave lights burning until dawn. I ignore the whispers that might be nothing more than water in drain pipes. So let me offer this advice. Should you ever find yourself in remote forests where fog forms quickly and moves against the wind, be wary of mist that seems darker than it should be, that moves with purpose rather than drifting aimlessly. Be suspicious of fog that forms walls rather than dispersing naturally, that pulses with rhythms too regular to be random. And if, God forbid, you hear whispers in that fog, your name, called by voices you almost recognize, don't listen. Don't approach. Run while you still can, while you're still full of yourself. Run, and hope the boundary of its territory isn't too far away. The black fog is patient, and it is hungry, and those it takes never truly die. They just wander forever, in darkness that thinks and hunts and waits. Listen, is that just rain you hear outside your window? Are you certain? Perhaps you should check, just to be sure.